7 years after his wife abandoned him for going bankrupt and cut all ties, a now billionaire CEO gets a text message from her that shakes him to his core. "I need to see you. It's about our son." Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching us from, and please like this video to support the channel. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. Daniel Whitmore had built an empire from the ruins of his past. 7 years ago, he had nothing, no money, no power, and worst of all, no one by his side. The woman he had loved with every fiber of his being had walked away without looking back, leaving him to drown in his failures. But now, the world saw him as untouchable. A billionaire CEO, a name that commanded respect and fear, a man who had clawed his way back from nothing. His life was structured, controlled, every aspect meticulously managed to ensure no one could hurt him again. Until tonight. The text arrived while he was in his penthouse office, going through projections for an upcoming merger. It was past midnight, the city lights stretching endlessly beyond the glass walls, a silent reminder of how far he had come. His phone vibrated, the sound barely noticeable, just another notification in a stream of constant business dealings. But when he glanced at the screen, his pulse stilled. "I need to see you. It's about our son." For a moment he didn't move. The words didn't make sense. They couldn't. His breath came shallow, the numbers on the screen blurring as his mind struggled to process the implications. His hands tightened around the phone as if it might slip away, taking the message with it, making it something he had imagined. But it was real. The name on the screen sent a shock through him, a name he hadn't seen in years yet had never truly escaped. Olivia. He forced himself to breathe, to push away the storm rising inside him. His ex-wife. The woman who had left him when he had hit rock bottom, who had disappeared without a trace. And now, she was back, with a message that shattered everything he thought he knew. A son? His son? No. It had to be a mistake. If she had been pregnant, he would have known. She would have told him. Wouldn't she? A sharp knock on the door pulled him out of his trance. Vanessa, his assistant, stepped inside, her expression calm but knowing. She had been with him long enough to read him better than most. "Sir? You look like you've seen a ghost." Daniel exhaled through his nose, setting his phone down with a forced steadiness. "It's nothing." Vanessa arched an eyebrow. "Nothing doesn't make you look like you're about to break your phone in half." He should have ignored it. Should have brushed it off and buried it like every other painful memory he had locked away over the years. But instead, he found himself saying, "Olivia texted me." The shift in Vanessa's posture was subtle but immediate. "What does she want?" He hesitated before answering, as if saying it aloud would make it more real. "She says it's about our son." Vanessa, who had been by his side through every stage of his rise to power, rarely showed emotion. But this time, her shock was clear. "Your son?" Daniel leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his jaw, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. "I don't have a son." "Apparently you do." He scoffed, though there was no humor in it. "No. If Olivia had been pregnant when she left, she would have told me. This is some kind of game. It has to be." Vanessa was quiet for a long moment before she spoke, her voice careful. "So, what are you going to do?" The logical answer was nothing. Olivia had lost the right to walk back into his life with cryptic messages and expect a response. He should delete the text, forget it ever happened. And yet, his fingers itched to reply, to demand answers, to see her face and hear the truth from her own lips. He had spent years building an empire, ensuring that he was in control of every aspect of his life. But this was something he hadn't accounted for. He had never considered the possibility that Olivia's betrayal had been more than just abandoning him. It had stolen something from him. Something he might never get back. Vanessa sighed, already knowing what he was going to do before he did. "If you're going to meet her, do it on your terms. Control the setting. Don't let her manipulate the situation." Daniel clenched his jaw, staring at the phone screen once more. A son. He couldn't ignore that possibility, no matter how much he wanted to. If it was true, if she had hidden his child from him for 7 years, there would be no forgiveness. His fingers hovered over the keyboard before he finally typed out a response. Tomorrow. 7 p.m. My office. He hit send before he could second-guess himself, his heart hammering against his ribs. The message was read instantly. I'll be there. The words sat on the screen like a promise, an omen of what was to come. 7 years of silence, broken in an instant. He had spent so long pretending Olivia no longer existed, that her leaving hadn't torn him apart. But now she was back, and she had brought with her the one thing that could shake the very foundation of the life he had built. Daniel leaned back in his chair, staring out at the city, but he no longer saw the skyline. His mind was somewhere else, trapped in the past, and memories he had tried to erase. Tomorrow, he would face the woman who had left him for dead. Tomorrow, he would get the answers he had never sought but suddenly couldn't live without. And depending on what she told him, tomorrow might change everything. The next evening, Daniel sat in his office, staring at the sleek, impersonal surface of his desk, his mind far from the towering glass walls and the world beyond them. He had spent the day pretending to work, reviewing reports, signing documents, but in truth, his thoughts had never strayed from what was about to happen. 7 years. 7 years of silence, of bitterness, of trying to forget the woman who had abandoned him when he needed her most. And now, she was about to walk through his door. At precisely 7 p.m., a quiet knock echoed through the office. He straightened, forcing his expression into the cold mask he had perfected over the years. Vanessa had already been instructed to let Olivia in, but he hadn't expected the strange tightening in his chest when the door opened. The woman standing before him was a ghost of the past, but not the one he remembered. She was thinner, almost frail, and the confidence she had once carried so effortlessly was gone. Her long auburn hair, once glossy and full of life, was dull, tied back in a way that did little to hide the exhaustion in her face. There were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before, and though she was still beautiful, there was something haunting about the way she held herself, as if the weight of the world pressed down on her shoulders. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken words and 7 years of resentment. Then Daniel stood, his voice colder than he intended. You have 5 minutes. Make it count. Olivia flinched, as if she had expected hostility but still wasn't prepared for its sharp edge. She stepped forward hesitantly, gripping the strap of her worn purse as if it was the only thing keeping her upright. Daniel, please. He cut her off, his anger simmering beneath the surface, barely restrained. No. You don't get to start with please. You disappeared. You left me when I had nothing. And now you show up after 7 years with a message about our son? You don't get to act like I owe you a conversation. Her lower lip trembled slightly, but she took a shaky breath, steadying herself. You're right. I don't deserve your kindness. But I'm here because you deserve the truth. His fists clenched at his sides. The truth? The truth is you walked away the second things got hard. You didn't just leave me, Olivia. You abandoned me when I needed you the most. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. I was pregnant when I left. The words hit him like a physical blow. He took a step back, unable to mask the flicker of shock before his expression hardened. No, he said flatly. No, you don't get to do that. You don't get to rewrite history to make yourself the victim. I'm not. She shook her head, voice trembling. I found out the same week you lost everything. I wanted to tell you I did. But we were drowning, Daniel. I was scared. I was scared of bringing a child into a life of poverty, of forcing him to suffer because we had nothing. His jaw tightened. So you just left? You made that decision on your own, without giving me a chance? I was terrified. Her voice broke. You were falling apart. You were drinking, spiraling, and I didn't know how to save you. And then I found out I was pregnant, and I panicked. I thought I was protecting him. Daniel let out a hollow laugh, his hands shaking with rage. Protecting him? From me? From his father? She wiped at her tears, looking down, ashamed. At first, yes. And then, when you rebuilt your life, when you became everything you were meant to be, it was too late. How could I come back after what I did? After walking away? He turned away, running a hand through his hair, trying to breathe through the storm raging inside him. 7 years. 7 years he could have had with his son. 7 years she had stolen from him. You had no right, he said, his voice quieter, but no less lethal. You had no right to make that choice for me. I know, she whispered. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. But I'm here now because Caleb, he deserves to know his father. And I don't have much time left. Something about the way she said it made his spine stiffen. There was an exhaustion in her voice, something deeper than guilt or regret. He turned to face her again, searching her face for the truth she wasn't saying. What does that mean? Before she could answer, her knees buckled. It happened too fast. One moment, she was standing, and the next, she was crumpling to the floor. He moved instinctively, catching her before she hit the ground, his heart slamming against his ribs as he lowered her carefully. Olivia? Her breath was shallow, her skin cold against his hands. Fear, sharp and unfamiliar, shot through him. This wasn't just exhaustion or stress. Something was wrong. Olivia, stay with me, he demanded, shaking her slightly, but her eyelids fluttered, barely able to focus on him. Daniel, she murmured weakly, and it was the first time she had said his name like that in years. Soft, familiar, like it belonged to another lifetime. Then her body went limp in his arms. Panic clawed at his chest as he pulled out his phone, dialing emergency services with hands that had built an empire but now trembled uselessly around the device. She collapsed, he told the dispatcher. She's unconscious. I don't know what's wrong, just send someone, now. He barely registered the response before the line went dead. His focus was on Olivia, on the woman who had shattered him once and now lay pale and motionless against him. He should have been furious. Should have wanted to let her go, to let her suffer the consequences of her choices. But none of that mattered in this moment. Because no matter how much he hated her for leaving, no matter how much she had betrayed him, another truth remained. Once, Olivia had been his world. And now, he might be losing her all over again. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and sterile air, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside Daniel's chest. He sat rigid in the uncomfortable waiting room chair, fingers steepled in front of him, elbows braced on his knees as he stared at the cold, white tiles. The echo of Olivia's name being called over the intercom felt surreal, like he had been transported to another time, one where she was still his wife, where they still had a future. But that wasn't reality. Reality was that she had collapsed in his arms, unconscious, her body weak and unresponsive. Reality was that he had spent the last 2 hours pacing the halls of the hospital, waiting for a doctor to tell him something, anything. And when the door finally opened, when a middle-aged man in a white coat stepped out with that practiced look of gentle detachment, Daniel knew before he even spoke that the news wouldn't be good. Mr. Whitmore? The doctor's voice was careful, measured, as though bracing for impact. Can we talk in private? Daniel rose to his feet, his pulse a steady drum against his temples. He followed the doctor down the corridor, past nurses moving with quiet urgency, past beeping machines and hushed voices. They stepped into a consultation room, and when the door clicked shut behind them, the air felt heavier, suffocating. How bad is it? Daniel asked, his voice sharper than he intended, but he didn't care. He had spent too many years controlling his emotions, burying them beneath layers of steel and ice. But this wasn't something he could contain. The doctor exhaled, folding his arms. Late-stage leukemia. She's known for a while, but based on what we're seeing, she's deteriorating faster than expected. If she continues refusing intensive treatment, she may only have a few months left. The words landed like a blow to the chest. Daniel's first instinct was to reject them, to call it a mistake, But doctors didn't deliver news like this unless they were sure. He swallowed, his throat dry. She didn't tell me. From what I understand, she's kept this from almost everyone, the doctor said. At this stage, chemotherapy would only slow it down. If she had started treatment earlier. Well, that's not where we are now. Daniel's hands curled into fists at his sides. 7 years. 7 years of silence, of anger, of believing she had moved on while he had rebuilt himself from the ground up. But the truth was uglier than he had imagined. Olivia hadn't just left him behind, she had been fighting a battle he never knew about. And she had lost. Can I see her? He asked, his voice quieter now. The doctor nodded. She's awake. But be gentle, Mr. Whitmore. She's running out of time. Daniel walked down the hall with slow, deliberate steps, his heart pounding harder with every inch he closed between them. When he stepped into her room, the sight of her stole the breath from his lungs. Olivia lay in the hospital bed, the fluorescent lights casting shadows across her pale skin. And four dripped steadily into her arm, and she looked smaller than he remembered, more fragile, as if the weight of her illness had hollowed her out from the inside. But her eyes, those deep, familiar eyes, still held fire when they landed on him. You stayed, she murmured, her voice hoarse but laced with something close to relief. Daniel shut the door behind him, shoving his hands into his pockets to keep them from shaking. I wasn't going to just leave you unconscious in the middle of my office. A tired smile ghosted her lips. No, I suppose you wouldn't. The room was silent for a moment, the tension thick. Daniel could still feel the lingering remnants of his anger, but it was tangled now with something more complicated. He had spent years resenting her for walking away, and yet, standing here, looking at her like this, he realized that no amount of rage could change what was happening to her. No amount of power could buy her more time. You should have told me, he said, his voice raw. About the cancer. About. He stopped himself, jaw tightening. Him. She closed her eyes for a brief moment before looking back at him. I know. But I was a coward. Daniel scoffed, shaking his head. That's not an excuse. I didn't think you'd forgive me. Olivia swallowed hard, looking down at her hands, at the thin foreline running into her veins. And maybe I didn't want to hear you tell me you never wanted to see me again. I thought I could live with my mistakes, but when I started getting sick, when I knew I wouldn't be around much longer,